This is an episode that appeared in the post-movie era of SpongeBob, and out of the top 25 episode list that I made back in 2017, and nearly giving my thoughts on most of the specials in the month of SpongeBob of last year in July, I honestly think that me talking about the good episodes in the show would probably not be worthy of my time. But considering that I want to do interesting things for this Summer Palooza, I decided to do a review on Friend or Foe, the episode where Mr. Krabs and Plankton were used to be friends before they became enemies against each other. Before I talk about the subplot, I'm just going to get to the main plot over with because that's what I'm mostly here for. You pretty much know how this episode starts off. Plankton about to steal the Krabby Patty formula, but then Mr. Krabs and his employees completely stop him. Well, mostly SpongeBob because Squidward doesn't usually do anything whatsoever. And this leads to the main point of this episode. Well, Mr. Krabs completely tells the story that he and Plankton were never the enemies since the beginning of time, which is the relationship. And I know I've always started talking about the plot of this episode, but considering of how this episode is constructed of what's going to happen next, I'm just going to get my thoughts onto the relationship between Plankton and Mr. Krabs. In all honesty, I honestly think that it's actually an interesting idea, but considering that this was during a time where Nickelodeon is just wanting SpongeBob to become more popular by making several bad episodes, this episode is honestly something that can easily be overshadowed on why this show got really difficult to watch at times. Sure, this was from season 5, but considering that some people say that season 4 and 5 are mostly mediocre at best, I honestly think that they probably overshadowed watching this because they pretty much cannot stand the fact that SpongeBob just isn't the same. I know this was released in 2007, which is around the time before Atlantis SquarePants came out, which actually turned off most SpongeBob fans. But one of the most important things I need to discuss about this episode is that it can't be good except that it's part of a post-movie era where SpongeBob just got really, really bad. But then again, I'm getting way ahead of myself. Do I actually enjoy this episode? To be quite honest, yes, but at the same time, not as much. Mainly the fact that even though that it's a great setup to actually see Plankton and Mr. Krabs actually becoming friends way earlier in their lives, it would have been much more better if this show just didn't have so many terrible episodes that were easily overshadowed. I mean, if the terrible episodes was just bad and not really bad, I can honestly think that this episode will probably not be that overshadowed. But one of the reasons onto why I think that this episode just isn't good as I think about it is mainly the fact that Nickelodeon is just desperately trying to have so many specials dedicated to SpongeBob, which is a ratings trap that they've been doing. And I'm sorry to burst your bubble, not a pun whatsoever, but this is pretty much one of those episodes that became a ratings trap. Not only these are one of those episodes that are just basically like Where's Gary, which was actually a good episode, but unlike in that episode, this episode just really wants to add some different ideas while just trying to continue on with SpongeBob. And this was an interesting idea, but the thing is, I honestly think that the relationship before Mr. Krabs and Plankton became enemies is honestly not really new or original. It's mostly generic, because even though that I've actually seen some other episodes when it comes to friendships and they become enemies afterwards in other shows, I honestly think that they probably did a lot more better, because even though that Plankton and Mr. Krabs are mainly learned in their childhood, obviously, it's still mostly predictable on what's going to happen next. And considering that this is only 22 minutes long and not 44 minutes, I honestly think that they probably didn't know what to do for this new build-up that they're going to have with Plankton and Mr. Krabs. Because let's go talk about the secret formula of the Krabby Patty, for example. when they tried to make their own patties, it didn't turn out well whatsoever, which leads to two alternative scenes where we get to see Plankton being evil while Mr. Krabs is the good guy, and vice versa. Yeah, I'm not making this up. There's actually two alternatives between when Plankton completely says that Mr. Krabs is evil, which doesn't even make any sense, and it's honestly mostly a waste of time. And what really makes this a little difficult to understand onto how Mr. Krabs' Krabby Patties has become much more popular when it comes to the Krusty Krab, which is his company business, is that when Plankton leaves, he slams the door, and all the ingredients just completely goes into the pot of hamburger sauce, or whatever you call it. That's just basically how easy to make a Krabby Patty. And even though we don't know those jars' ingredients, it's honestly lazy writing if you actually think about it. So I honestly think that this newborn Krabby Patty thing, with its beginnings, just obviously is honestly generic and didn't have a great setup whatsoever. I mean, sure, it really made Mr. Krabs from becoming a poor crab to a really greedy crab, even though he was greedy when he was learned. It's honestly really difficult to actually make me convinced that all this happened because he got famous, all because Plankton slammed the door and these just got into the pot. I'm really, really sorry, but some of these ideas that they did for this episode can work, but at the same time, it's just mostly a way to make this episode mainly a ratings trap, which is why I don't easily enjoy this episode as much as other people do when it comes to talking about good SpongeBob episodes in the post-movie era. I mean, I am not expecting a lot of detail between Plankton and Mr. Krabs because they pretty much did that in the beginning of this episode, but considering of how this episode continues for the second half, it really makes the second half mainly an excuse to have Plankton and Mr. Krabs going against each other because they're not good at making patties, and then an accident happens which actually makes Krusty Krab a thing, as well as the Krabby Patties. And one of the reasons onto why they completely opened the hamburger business is because Stinky's Patties, who is this character's name on screen, is obviously being really selfish to them because he's poor and everyone, just like everyone, is just making fun of him. In all honesty, the fact that the mean-spirited stuff is still here in this episode really doesn't make this episode a lot more entertaining whatsoever because it's getting repetitive and it doesn't make the episode a lot more better. I understand that not every character has to be nice and stuff like that, but when you have a setup between two gonna be enemies in the future and ends up getting this much hate by so many people and making fun of, it really makes this whole thing really difficult to actually make me convinced that everyone else who is used to be Stinky's customers completely jumping ship to the Krabby Patties because of how popular they become, mainly the fact that Stinky's store has been shut down because of health reasons. I'm not sure onto how this happened, and I probably forgot about looking at this information other than the fact that Stinky is completely out of business, but I'm pretty sure that he probably didn't look at the food that he made whatsoever, and his arguments against Mr. Krabs and Plankton is obviously his way of just hiding something so that no one can actually see it coming. And to be quite honest, his selfish behavior against Mr. Krabs and Plankton really makes him mostly an idiot and completely not thinking ahead of what he's been doing throughout this time. Because let's be honest, the fact that we never got to see him again and he completely leaves with a limo of money, and then it leads to his restaurant completely shut down, really goes to show that I think that some people really need to actually think before they act because attitudes are mostly important. And considering of how Stinky's attitude was in this episode, I honestly think that his restaurant shutting down was all on him. And just like in most SpongeBob specials, we get to see Patchy and Potty. Now, in this, they're looking at the poop deck, yep. They're working at a poop deck, which is a restaurant, just like the Krusty Krab and SpongeBob. And Patchy is coming up with ideas, but Polly completely disagrees with him, to the point that it ended the relationship. I will usually call this juvenile, but this is Patchy the Pirate we're talking about, and it's played by the same guy who's voicing SpongeBob, Tom Kenny. So I honestly think that this subplot here is actually one of the things that I can actually tolerate the most when it comes to Patchy the Pirate, but in all honesty, since that he's just basically doing the same thing of what's happening between Mr. Krabs and Plankton, I'm honestly thinking that he is way too obsessed with SpongeBob to the point that he wants to be just like SpongeBob. Then again, he's being portrayed as Tom Kenny while Tom Kenny voices SpongeBob in the cartoon. There's really nothing else I can say about this other than the fact that it's only there because it's a SpongeBob special. We all know full well that Patchy the Pirate and Polly is going to be part of this if SpongeBob is going to be a special, but in some other ways, since that Patchy and Polly don't appear in most of the specials in SpongeBob. All I can say is that the argument between Patchy's making skills and the fact that Polly completely disagrees with him is only this ways of excusing that they're just trying to do this story again, except in live action, which isn't a problem since that SpongeBob is catered to kids. It's honestly make me mostly think that this special is just dragging out because they probably don't know how to add more things in, which mostly goes against my argument onto why this special isn't 44 minutes long. As for the ending of this special, it really goes to show that we pretty much seen the same thing repeatedly every single time between the competition of the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket. I honestly think that Plankton doesn't even understand onto how to make proper food correctly while Mr. Krabs does, despite the fact that the ingredients just completely goes into the pot like I mentioned before. The ending was pretty much good and actually leads to what the Krusty Krab is today, but at the same time, it honestly makes it still predictable nonetheless. We pretty much know that Mr. Krabs is going to win, which actually leads to, at the end of the story, actually getting this close to actually see a rejoicement between Mr. Krabs and Plankton. But this just ends up being the same thing like every other episode between Mr. Krabs and Plankton. So I honestly got nothing else to say other than it's the same thing, except that we're just going to have to deal with this until this show actually comes to an end, which I highly doubt it will ever will. Especially that the third movie that is now postponed is going to be premiering eventually in this year or the following year. So, friend or foe, I did enjoy you when I watched you the first time when I was young, but a lot can happen, and to be quite honest, I honestly think that this was still a Wayne's Trap episode, just so that SpongeBob can actually have some good episodes, despite being overshadowed by the really bad ones. I know some of you guys may like this episode, but in all honesty, I honestly think that I cannot take this episode seriously like I used to in the past. It just really goes to show that when I get older, you're just going to see a lot of stuff that you just haven't thought of when you got longer. To be a bit nice, the rating that this episode gets will be a 6.5 out of 10. Yeah, these ratings I've been giving for this month isn't really the best, but I'm just trying to review the materials that I was planning to do in the past, but just couldn't get to them. I'm only giving this episode some kind of credit, but at the same time, with this being the Wayne's Trap, I honestly think that I don't enjoy this episode like I used to. This really goes against onto why I don't watch SpongeBob anymore, especially with the newer episodes.